2:30 a.m. ICU floor 4. The sterile halls of Berkshire Medical Center hummed with the ghostly rhythm of life support machines. James Crawford guided his janitor's cart through the VIP wing, his faded blue uniform almost invisible against the gleaming marble floors where medical miracles carried seven-figure price tags. Through the glass walls of room 412, he stopped dead. A 17-year-old girl lay frozen in time, golden hair cascading across pristine pillows, her arms twisted inward in a position that sent ice through his veins. The man in the $1,000 suit collapsed beside her bed, looked like he'd surrendered to grief itself. James had witnessed that exact devastation before, staring back at him from bathroom mirrors 3 years ago. His hand moved without permission, knocking softly on the glass. When the CEO's hollow, bloodshot eyes met his, James heard himself whisper words that defied every rule of his invisible existence. "Sir, I think I can help her." The silence that followed held the weight of impossible promises. The autumn of 2024 had painted Berkshire Hills in shades of gold and crimson, but inside the medical center's walls, seasons held no meaning. For 18 months now, James had walked these corridors in the shadows, his existence reduced to emptying trash bins and mopping floors that reflected the lives he could no longer touch. His weathered hands, once steady enough to perform brain surgery, now gripped a mop handle with the same precision he'd once used to save lives. The irony wasn't lost on him, cleaning up messes instead of healing them. His trailer home on the outskirts of town was a far cry from the Cambridge brownstone he'd once shared with Isabella, but it was honest work that let him pick up his 8-year-old son Danny from school without questions about his past. Tonight, however, something about the girl in room 412 had shattered his carefully constructed invisibility. Robert Ashford lifted his head slowly, studying the janitor's face with the wariness of a man who'd learned that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. His daughter Grace had been lying motionless for 3 months now, ever since the botched brain surgery that was supposed to remove what doctors insisted was an aggressive tumor. Every specialist from Boston to New York had delivered the same verdict: complete paralysis, minimal brain function, no chance of recovery. "You're the night janitor," Robert said, his voice hoarse from weeks of whispered prayers that went unanswered. "What could you possibly know about helping her?" The question carried no malice, only the exhausted resignation of a father who'd already buried his hope alongside his wife's memory. James looked past him to Grace, noting the telltale positioning of her limbs, the slight flutter of her eyelids that the medical team had dismissed as meaningless reflexes. "I know what I'm seeing," James replied quietly, stepping closer to the glass. "And what I'm seeing isn't what they told you it was." His words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Robert had been forced to accept. The CEO of Ashford Healthcare Insurance, a man whose company had built an empire on calculated medical decisions, found himself face to face with a maintenance worker who spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen this before. Robert's hand trembled as he reached for the door handle, a gesture that would either invite in a miracle or confirm his descent into madness. Behind them, Grace's monitors continued their steady rhythm, oblivious to the conversation that might change everything. "She can hear us," James added, his eyes never leaving the girl's face. "I'd bet my life on it." 2 days later, James returned to room 412 carrying a worn leather notebook and an old tablet that had seen better years. This time, he'd traded his janitor's uniform for dark jeans and a navy flannel shirt, simple clothes that somehow restored a piece of his dignity. Robert sat in the same chair he'd occupied for months, but now his posture held a different quality, the rigid desperation replaced by something that might have been curiosity. "You came back," Robert observed, noting how the janitor moved with the measured steps of someone accustomed to hospital environments in a different capacity. James nodded toward Grace, whose blonde hair had been brushed away from her face, revealing features that reminded him painfully of another young woman who'd fought a losing battle against medical odds. "I made a promise," he said simply, "and I always keep my promises to sleeping princesses." The gentle humor in his voice seemed to reach something deep within the room's sterile atmosphere. Instead of addressing Robert, James pulled a chair close to Grace's bedside and began speaking directly to her. "Hey there, Grace. I'm James. I heard you wanted to be a doctor before all this happened." He watched carefully as her eyes tracked the smallest movement, confirming what he'd suspected during his first glimpse of her condition. Her responses were subtle, a slight change in breathing when he mentioned medical school, a barely perceptible shift in muscle tension when he talked about helping other patients someday. These weren't random reflexes. They were signs of a consciousness trapped inside a body that had forgotten how to respond. Robert leaned forward, studying his daughter's face with new intensity. "Is she actually listening?" he whispered. James placed his hand gently on Grace's arm, feeling for responses that conventional medicine had written off as impossible. "She's not just listening," he replied. "She's fighting to get back to you." The room fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the soft sounds of medical equipment and Grace's steady breathing. James opened his notebook, revealing pages filled with detailed observations about neurological recovery patterns that seemed far too sophisticated for a maintenance worker. "Recovery isn't always about grand gestures," he explained to Robert. "Sometimes it's about remembering that hope isn't just an emotion, it's a medical treatment they don't teach in textbooks." Robert found himself studying the janitor's hands as they moved across the pages, noting the surgical precision in movements that seemed at odds with his humble occupation. "You're not really a janitor, are you?" Robert asked quietly. James met his eyes with a look that carried years of hidden pain and hard-earned wisdom. "I'm whatever Grace needs me to be right now," he answered. "The question is, are you ready to trust someone the system threw away?" A week passed before James returned with something that made Robert question everything he thought he knew about the mysterious janitor. Tucked under his arm were medical journals that looked well-read and annotated, their pages marked with the kind of detailed analysis that suggested deep professional knowledge. But it was the small cello case that truly caught Robert's attention, an instrument that seemed oddly out of place in the sterile medical environment. "Music therapy," James explained, setting up the instrument with practiced ease. "The brain responds to things that conventional medicine often overlooks." As he began to play a gentle melody, Grace's vital signs showed the first significant change they'd registered in months. Her heart rate increased slightly, her breathing deepened, and most remarkably, her fingers began to move in tiny, almost imperceptible gestures that matched the rhythm of the music. Robert watched in amazement as his daughter seemed to emerge from her motionless state, responding to stimuli that million-dollar equipment had failed to detect. "How did you know to try this?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. James paused in his playing, his fingers still resting on the strings. "My wife used to say that healing happens when we remember we're more than just our broken parts," he replied. "Grace isn't broken, she's just lost. The music is helping her find her way back." The admission about his wife carried a weight that suggested personal experience with loss, and Robert found himself wondering what tragedies had shaped this enigmatic man who appeared in their lives like an unlikely guardian angel. On Grace's bedside table sat an antique pocket watch that Robert barely remembered placing there, a family heirloom that had belonged to his mother. James's eyes lingered on it with an expression that seemed to recognize something familiar, though he said nothing about the coincidence. When James carefully picked up the pocket watch, his hands began to shake with an emotion he thought he'd buried years ago. The inscription on the back read, "To Isabella, my dearest friend. Love, Margaret Ashford." Words that connected his dead wife to this family in ways that defied explanation. "Where did Grace get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert looked puzzled by the sudden change in the janitor's demeanor. "It belonged to my mother's college roommate. They lost touch when Mom married wealthy and Isabella married some struggling medical student. Isabella died about 3 years ago. Cancer, I think." The revelation hit James like a physical blow, confirming that the woman he'd failed to save had been best friends with Grace's grandmother. Fate, it seemed, had brought him full circle to face both his greatest failure and his chance at redemption. The pocket watch had stopped working at 3:47 a.m., the exact time Isabella had died in his arms after his experimental treatment failed. Robert began to notice inconsistencies in James's story that couldn't be explained by simple maintenance work. The way he instinctively checked Grace's pupil responses when she had a minor seizure episode. The professional manner in which he adjusted her positioning to prevent bed sores. the complex medical terminology that slipped naturally into his conversations. Most telling was the research paper James was reading when he thought no one was looking, a cutting-edge study on neuroplasticity that would challenge even experienced neurologists. "James," Robert said carefully, "I need to know who you really are." The janitor looked up from the scientific journal, his cover blown by his own expertise. "I'm someone who made a terrible mistake trying to save the person I loved most," he replied. "And now I'm trying to figure out if I can save yours without making the same mistake twice." The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible divide. That evening, Dr. Patricia Hayes arrived for a consultation, a neurologist from Mass General whom Robert had flown in as a last resort. She walked past James without a second glance until she stopped dead in her tracks, recognizing something that made her spin around in shock. "James Crawford?" she said, her voice carrying disbelief. "I thought you disappeared after the Isabella incident. What on earth are you doing here dressed as a janitor?" The name Confirmation hit Robert like a revelation. Dr. James Crawford, the once brilliant neurologist who'd been stripped of his medical license for attempting unauthorized experimental treatments. James closed his eyes as his carefully constructed anonymity crumbled around him. "Hello, Patricia," he said quietly. "And I'm here because Grace needs someone who understands that sometimes the system gets it wrong." The confrontation he dreaded for 18 months had finally arrived, bringing with it the weight of his past failures and the promise of either redemption or final ruin. Robert's face cycled through confusion, anger, and something approaching betrayal as the truth sank in. "You're Dr. James Crawford," he said slowly. "The doctor who experimented on his own wife. The one who lost his license for reckless endangerment." James nodded, accepting the accusations he'd lived with every day since Isabella's death. "I didn't experiment on her, Robert. I tried to save her when every conventional treatment failed. Your insurance company, Ashford Healthcare, denied coverage for every innovative therapy we requested. Isabella died waiting for approval that never came." The words hit Robert with the force of personal responsibility, connecting his corporate decisions to this man's personal tragedy. "You're saying we denied your wife's treatment?" Robert asked, though he already knew the answer from the haunted look in James's eyes. "Check your records from 3 years ago," James replied. "Isabella Crawford, brain tumor, experimental treatment denials, multiple appeals rejected. She died because the system valued profit over patience." The confrontation escalated as Robert grappled with the implications of James's presence in his daughter's room. "So this is revenge?" Robert demanded. "You're here to experiment on Grace because we failed your wife?" James's jaw tightened with controlled emotion. "If I wanted revenge, I would have walked away and let your daughter die the same way Isabella did, ignored by a system that prioritizes procedures over people. Instead, I'm here because Grace deserves the chance my wife never got." The two men stood face to face, representing opposite sides of a healthcare divide that had cost one of them everything and might cost the other his daughter. "The difference is," James continued, "I'm not asking for permission this time. Grace doesn't have time for insurance committees and medical boards to debate her worth." Robert felt the weight of every denial his company had ever issued, suddenly seeing them not as business decisions but as death sentences for families like his own. Danny burst into the room at that moment, having escaped from his babysitter with the determined resourcefulness of an 8-year-old on a mission. He carried a small robot toy that had been carefully repaired with tape and wire, evidence of his father's patient attention to broken things. "Dad, you forgot Mr. Sparks," he announced, seemingly oblivious to the tension filling the room. "Grace needs to see him because he can walk again now that you've fixed his circuits." The innocent interruption broke through the adult anger like sunlight through storm clouds, reminding everyone present that this wasn't about corporate policies or professional grudges. It was about a young woman fighting for her life. Grace's eyes tracked Danny's movements with more clarity than she'd shown in months, and for the first time since her surgery, she attempted to smile. The expression was barely visible, but it was unmistakably intentional, a sign that consciousness was struggling to reassert itself against impossible odds. "You see that?" James said urgently, pointing to Grace's face, She's responding to emotional stimuli, not just physical ones. This isn't brain death or permanent damage, it's a communication breakdown between her consciousness and her motor functions. Robert looked at his daughter with new eyes, seeing past the medical labels to recognize the person still trapped inside. Danny plopped his robot toy on Grace's bedside table, next to the pocket watch. "My dad says broken things can be fixed if you know where the real problem is," he explained to Grace, with the matter-of-fact wisdom of childhood. "He fixed Mommy's robot things after she died, and now he's gonna fix you too." The simple faith in Danny's voice carried more healing power than all the medical equipment surrounding them. James knelt beside his son, realizing that Grace's breakthrough was happening not because of medical intervention, but because of human connection, and the hope that comes from being truly seen. The moment of breakthrough was interrupted by a crisis that threatened to undo everything they'd accomplished. Grace's monitors began alarming as her vital signs became erratic, a complication that the attending physicians couldn't stabilize with conventional interventions. James watched helplessly as the medical team worked, his hands literally tied by his lack of official authority to intervene. "She's having a neurological event," Dr. Hayes explained to Robert. "There's swelling in the area we can't reach surgically. We need to prepare you for the possibility that this might be—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. Robert looked at James with desperation that transcended their earlier conflict. "Can you help her?" he asked. "Right now I don't care about licenses or insurance policies or past mistakes. Can you save my daughter?" James felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. His failure with Isabella, his exile from medicine, his desperate need for redemption. "If I do this, there's no going back," James warned. "If Grace dies, I'll be charged with practicing without a license. If she lives, you'll have to live with knowing that the system you built almost killed her." Robert didn't hesitate. "Then save her," he said simply. "Save her the way you couldn't save Isabella." The words gave James permission to be the doctor he'd never stopped being in his heart. As he approached Grace's bedside with hands that remembered their training, despite years of pushing mop buckets, he felt Isabella's presence like a guiding spirit. The pocket watch on the nightstand caught his eye, its stopped hands a reminder that some moments exist outside of time, in the space where love transcends loss and hope conquers despair. "Grace," he whispered, "your grandmother's friend is here to help. Isabella never got her second chance, but you're gonna get yours." His hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who'd never forgotten how to heal, even when the world had forgotten how to trust him. Working without official authority, but with Robert's desperate consent, James began the delicate process of relieving the pressure on Grace's brain, using techniques that existed in the gray area between approved medicine and innovative treatment. Dr. Hayes assisted reluctantly, torn between professional obligations and the undeniable skill she was witnessing. "This procedure isn't in any textbook," she murmured, as James worked with instruments that seemed to bend to his will. "That's because textbooks are written by committees," James replied without looking up from his work. "Grace doesn't need committee approval. She needs someone willing to see past the standard protocols to the person underneath." As he worked, Grace's responses became more pronounced, her fingers moving deliberately rather than randomly, her eyes tracking with increasing focus and awareness. The pocket watch on her nightstand seemed to tick in rhythm with her improving vital signs, as if time itself was choosing to move forward again. The breakthrough came not with dramatic fanfare but with a quiet moment of recognition. As James completed the procedure, Grace's eyes opened fully for the first time in months, focusing directly on his face with unmistakable consciousness. "Hello, Grace," he said gently. "Welcome back." Her lips moved slightly, forming words that took tremendous effort but carried infinite meaning. "Thank you." Robert collapsed into his chair, overwhelmed by emotions he'd suppressed for months of hoping against hope. Dr. Hayes stared in professional amazement at results that shouldn't have been possible according to every medical text she'd studied. "How did you know?" she asked James. "How did you know this would work?" James looked at the pocket watch, its hands still frozen at 3:47 a.m. "Because sometimes the dead teach us how to save the living," Dora said. He replied, "Isabella couldn't be saved by experimental treatment, but Grace could be saved by understanding that her condition was misdiagnosed from the beginning. The revelation that changed everything came when Dr. Hayes reviewed Grace's original scans with the fresh perspective that James's success had provided. "This wasn't a brain tumor at all," she announced, her voice filled with professional embarrassment and human relief. "It was a vascular malformation that mimicked tumor characteristics on basic imaging. The original surgery failed because they were treating the wrong condition entirely." James nodded grimly, understanding how easy it was for conventional medicine to see what it expected rather than what was actually there. Grace never needed experimental treatment, he explained to Robert. She needed someone to look past the obvious diagnosis to find the real problem. The paralysis was caused by surgical trauma to healthy tissue, not by disease. The misdiagnosis meant that Grace's 3 months of suffering could have been avoided entirely with proper initial evaluation. Robert felt the weight of systemic failure settling on his shoulders. His own company had contributed to medical errors by prioritizing cost-secondary standard procedures over thorough diagnostic work. As Grace regained more of her motor functions over the following days, the pocket watch became a symbol of healing that transcended its original purpose. James carefully wound the mechanism, bringing the stopped timepiece back to life as he had done for Grace herself. "This belonged to my wife," he told Grace during one of her therapy sessions. "Isabella would want you to have it, to remember that time can start again, even when it seems permanently stopped." Grace accepted the gift with hands that were growing stronger each day, understanding instinctively that she was receiving more than just a family heirloom. She was inheriting a legacy of hope, maintained through the darkest circumstances. The watch's steady ticking became a metronome for her recovery, marking progress in small increments that added up to miraculous change. Robert watched these moments of connection with growing understanding that healing involved more than medical procedures. It required human touch, personal investment, and the willingness to see patients as people rather than problems to be solved. Robert's offer came during a quiet moment when Grace was sleeping peacefully for the first time since her ordeal began. "I want to establish a foundation for experimental medical treatments," he told James. "Will you head it? Will you come back to medicine officially?" James considered the proposal carefully, understanding that acceptance meant returning to a world that had cast him out, while rejection meant abandoning the chance to prevent other families from experiencing what he and Robert had endured. "I'll consult," he finally agreed. "But I won't sacrifice Danny's childhood for my career again. Some things matter more than saving the world." The compromise reflected hard-won wisdom about balance and priority that his earlier ambition had never allowed him to understand. "Maybe we can save one person at a time," Grace added weakly from her bed, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. Her words captured the essence of medical practice at its most human level. Not grand gestures or revolutionary breakthroughs, but individual moments of healing that accumulated into meaningful change. 6 months later, spring had returned to Berkshire Hills, bringing with it new life and renewed hope. James's trailer had been replaced by a modest house with a garden where Danny could play while his father worked reasonable hours as a consulting neurologist for the Ashford Medical Foundation. The arrangement allowed James to practice medicine again while maintaining the work-life balance that his earlier career had never permitted. Robert visited monthly. Their relationship evolved from employee-employer to something resembling cautious friendship, built on shared experience of loss and recovery. Grace had not only regained full motor function, but had enrolled in community college to study physical therapy, determined to help other trauma patients navigate their own journeys back to wholeness. Her recovery had become a source of inspiration for families facing similar challenges, proof that hope and proper treatment could overcome even the most devastating medical setbacks. The pocket watch now traveled with Grace wherever she went, a tangible reminder of the connections that transcend death and bind strangers together through compassion. Today she was bringing it to the children's ward, where a 7-year-old girl named Sophie was recovering from her own brain injury. "My friend Isabella wanted you to have this," Grace told Sophie, placing the watch in small hands that were just learning to grip objects again. "It helps time heal everything, but you have to wind it every day to keep the healing going." The gesture completed a circle of giving that had begun with Isabella's friendship with Grace's grandmother, continued through James's desperate attempt to save his wife, and now extended to a new generation of patients who needed to believe in second chances. Sophie's eyes lit up with wonder as she listened to the watch's steady rhythm, the sound becoming a promise that time would indeed move forward, carrying healing in its measured progression. The house felt different now, filled with the sounds of recovery and renewal that James had thought were lost forever. Danny's laughter echoed from the backyard, where he was teaching Grace to throw a curveball, their easy friendship a bridge between the pain of the past and the promise of the future. Robert joined them for dinner occasionally, his expensive suits replaced by casual clothes that reflected his growing comfort with a life defined by relationships rather than corporate achievements. These gatherings were marked not by dramatic declarations or emotional speeches, but by the quiet satisfaction of shared meals and comfortable conversation. The transformation was complete not because wounds had been erased, but because scars had been integrated into new patterns of living that honored both loss and hope. James stood at his kitchen window, watching the scene unfold in his backyard with gratitude that felt both foreign and familiar. The view reminded him of hospital corridors, where everything had begun, but now the resemblance brought peace rather than pain. His hands, once trembling with guilt and uncertainty, now moved with the steady confidence of someone who had learned to balance professional skill with personal wisdom. On the mantelpiece, Isabella's photograph sat beside Danny's school awards and Grace's physical therapy certification, creating a visual timeline that connected past grief to present joy. Robert appeared beside him, following his gaze to the children playing in the yard. "Do you think Isabella would approve of how this turned out?" Robert asked quietly. James smiled without turning from the window. "She always said the best way to honor the dead is to help the living find their way back to hope," he replied. "I think she'd be proud that her death somehow led to Grace's healing." The afternoon light filtered through the window blinds, creating patterns on the floor that reminded James of those first uncertain moments in the ICU, when everything had seemed impossible. Now those same patterns suggested connection rather than separation, healing rather than loss. The pocket watch on the mantelpiece ticked steadily, marking time that moved forward rather than standing still in grief. Grace's laughter from the yard mixed with Danny's excited chatter about baseball strategies, creating a soundtrack of renewal that filled spaces once occupied by silence and regret. This wasn't the ending James had planned when he first put on a janitor's uniform 18 months ago, but it was the ending that Isabella's love had made possible. Not perfect, not without scars, but real and ongoing, and full of the kind of hope that survives even the deepest losses. The story concluded not with grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but with the simple recognition that healing happens in daily choices to show up, to care, and to believe that broken things can be mended with patience and love. James had learned that redemption doesn't erase the past but transforms it into wisdom that can benefit others. Robert had discovered that true success isn't measured in corporate profits, but in lives touched by compassion and understanding. Grace had found that survival can become a gift to offer others facing their own battles with despair. And somewhere in the space between memory and hope, Isabella's spirit lived on in every life that was saved by the love she had taught them all to carry forward.